Think Dubai is the city of the future? Think again. What you're about to read dismantles the most expensive illusion of the 21st century. Dubai is broke. Not the kind of broke where you skip a vacation. The kind where an entire city-state, built on the premise that you can consider and can will a metropolis into existence with enough concrete and ambition, nearly defaulted on $80 billion in debt and had to be bailed out by its oil-rich neighbor like a teenager calling dad from a police station. And that was 2009. What's happened since is worse because the fundamental problem was never fixed. It was buried under another layer of glass and steel. You've been told Dubai is the future, a masterclass in economic diversification, proof that a desert with no rivers, no farmland, and no democratic institutions can outbuild, outspend, and outshine the capitals of the developed world. That narrative is a lie, not a small one, an engineered, marketed, architecturally spectacular lie that has been repeated so many times it became consensus. Here's the thesis that will make the next 20 minutes worth your time. Every artificial city in history, every metropolis conjured from political will rather than organic economic necessity, has either collapsed or hollowed out. Every single one. And Dubai is further along that trajectory than anyone in the Gulf wants to admit. There's a specific financial mechanism that makes this inevitable, and almost nobody talks about it. We'll get there. The pumpkin economics of spectacle. Before we touch Dubai, you need to understand a city that tried the exact same playbook 3 centuries earlier and failed so completely that its name became a synonym for fraud. In 1711, the South Sea Company convinced the British Parliament that it could transform worthless government debt into spectacular wealth by monopolizing trade with South America. The hook was identical to Dubai's pitch. We will create something from nothing. We will manufacture prosperity where none exists. All you have to do is believe. Investors poured money in. The stock price surged 800% in months. Isaac Newton himself bought shares, lost a fortune, and reportedly said he could calculate the motion of heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people. The South Sea bubble collapsed because there was no underlying trade. No ships were sailing, no goods were moving. The entire edifice was built on the assumption that confidence could replace commerce, that marketing could substitute for markets. Dubai operates on the same principle, just with better architecture. Jim Crane, who spent years as an Associated Press correspondent in the Gulf, documented something remarkable in his research on Dubai's economic model. The Emirates' GDP composition tells a story that contradicts everything you've heard. Real estate and construction have consistently accounted for a disproportionate share of economic output. Not technology, not manufacturing, not innovation, buildings. Glass towers erected not because tenants demanded them, but because the act of building itself became the product. This is the critical distinction most analysts miss. In organic cities, London, New York, Tokyo, construction follows demand. Businesses arrive, populations grow, and buildings rise to house them. In Dubai, the sequence is inverted. Buildings rise first, then the government spends billions marketing the city to attract enough tenants to fill them. The product isn't office space or residential units. The product is the illusion of inevitability. Build it so big, so fast, so audaciously that the world assumes there must be substance behind the spectacle. The World Bank's studies on UAE economic diversification reveal an uncomfortable truth. Despite decades of rhetoric about moving beyond hydrocarbons, the UAE's non-oil GDP growth has been overwhelmingly concentrated in sectors that are themselves dependent on oil wealth: real estate, tourism, retail, financial services that primarily serve regional petrodollar flows. Strip away the activities funded directly or indirectly by hydrocarbon revenues, and what remains is thin, remarkably thin for a city that markets itself as the commercial capital of the 21st century. Here's a number that should stop you cold. The Brookings Institution's research on UAE economic development found that government spending, directly and through state-owned enterprises, accounts for a share of GDP that would classify most Western nations as command economies. Private sector growth that isn't connected to government contracts, government land grants, or government-sponsored free zones is startlingly modest. The free zones themselves, those celebrated hubs of international commerce, operate on subsidized land with subsidized utilities under regulatory frameworks designed by the state. They're not free markets. They're curated terrariums that would suffocate without government life support. Juan Cole's analysis of Gulf economic fragility identified something even more fundamental. Dubai's service economy, the tourism, the retail, the financial intermediation, is ultimately a recycling mechanism for petrodollars generated elsewhere in the Gulf. Money flows from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, and Abu Dhabi into Dubai's hotels, malls, and real estate. Dubai adds a margin, takes a commission, and calls it economic diversification. But the source of the funds hasn't diversified at all. It's still oil. Dubai just added extra steps. So why hasn't it collapsed already? Because Dubai discovered something the South Sea Company never had, a neighbor with the deepest pockets on Earth. And here's where I have to tell you something that ties directly into what I just laid out. YouTube has officially demonetized this channel. Not because the research is wrong, but because it's too sharp for the advertisers who fund this platform. They want soft, they want safe. They want the version of finance that keeps you watching, but never threatens to actually wake you up. I'm not bending, I'm doubling down. The raw, unfiltered, uncensored finance videos, the ones that go further than the algorithm will ever let me, now live somewhere they cannot reach. Click the link in the description and join me on Patreon. Most people will close this tab and forget. The ones who don't are the ones who understand what's actually at stake. Stay with me. What comes next is the part they really don't want you to see. The Abu Dhabi leash. February 2009. The global financial crisis reached the Persian Gulf. Dubai's property market crashed 50% in months. Nakheel, the state-owned developer behind the Palm Jumeirah, that artificial island shaped like a palm tree, visible from space, could not meet its debt obligations. Dubai World, the government's investment conglomerate, announced it needed to restructure $26 billion in liabilities. Credit default swaps on Dubai's debts spiked to levels associated with sovereign default. The world held its breath, and then Abu Dhabi wrote a check. $20 billion wired in tranches. No public negotiation, no IMF conditionality, just a quiet transfer from the emirate that sits on 90% of the UAE's oil reserves to the emirate that spent the last 2 decades pretending oil didn't matter. This bailout is the single most important event in Dubai's modern history, and it is the one least discussed because it revealed the fundamental architecture of the Dubai model. Dubai is not an independent economic entity. It is a subsidiary, a theme park operated under license from Abu Dhabi's sovereign wealth fund, with the implicit understanding that the brand will be maintained as long as the franchise remains useful. The IMF's Article 4 consultation reports on the UAE, the ones that get published in dry bureaucratic language nobody reads, contain data that should alarm anyone invested in Dubai's story. Government-related entities in Dubai carry debt levels that, relative to the Emirates' own GDP, dwarf those of most sovereign nations that have actually defaulted. The debt didn't disappear after 2009. It was rolled over, restructured, extended, repackaged. The same trick every overleveraged entity uses when the alternative is admitting insolvency. Christopher Davidson, a British academic who spent years studying Gulf political economy, argued that the financial relationship between Dubai and Abu Dhabi resembles something closer to a feudal arrangement than a modern federal system. Abu Dhabi provides the backstop, Dubai provides the brand. The brand is useful because it attracts foreign capital, foreign talent, and foreign attention away from the more conservative, less photogenic realities of Abu Dhabi's own governance model. But here's what makes this arrangement fragile. It depends entirely on Abu Dhabi's willingness to keep paying. And that willingness is not guaranteed. It's conditional, it's political, and it can be withdrawn. Why artificial cities die? Now we arrive at the mechanism nobody discusses. The reason every city built by decree rather than demand eventually fails. And it's not what you think. It's not corruption, though there's plenty. It's not authoritarianism, though that accelerates the timeline. It's not even debt, though debt is the symptom. The killer is a concept economists call allocative inefficiency. And in plain language, it means this: when a single authority decides what gets built, where, and for whom, they always get it wrong. Always. Not sometimes, not usually, every time, at scale, over sufficient duration. Organic cities are brutal. They're messy, inefficient, ugly, and they work. They work because millions of individual decisions, each one driven by self-interest, competition, and local knowledge, produce an emergent order that no central planner could design. A restaurant opens on a street corner because the owner noticed foot traffic. A tech company locates in a neighborhood because the talent pool lives nearby. A hospital expands because patient volume demands it. Each decision is small, testable, and reversible. Bad restaurants close, unprofitable offices empty. The city adapts continuously, ruthlessly, organically. Dubai cannot do this because Dubai's economy is directed from the top. The ruler's office decides which sectors to promote. State-owned enterprises execute the vision. Government-linked developers build the projects, and the entire apparatus is insulated from the market signals that would normally kill bad ideas before they metastasize. The Palm Jumeirah is the perfect case study. An artificial island requiring billions in infrastructure, built on the assumption that wealthy foreigners would pay premium prices for beachfront property in a jurisdiction with no property rights tradition, no independent judiciary to enforce contracts, and summer temperatures that make outdoor living physically dangerous for 5 months of the year. The engineering was spectacular. The economics were delusional. Property values on the Palm crashed during the 2009 crisis and took over a decade to recover. Several planned successor projects, the Palm Jebel Ali, the Palm Deira, were quietly shelved or dramatically scaled back. Karen Young, who researches Gulf economic transformation at the American Enterprise Institute, has documented a pattern across Gulf state megaprojects that mirrors what development economists have observed in every command economy from the Soviet Union to modern China. The projects that get built are not the projects the economy needs. They're the projects that serve political narratives. Prestige towers, artificial islands, indoor ski slopes in the desert. These aren't investments, they're advertisements. And advertisements don't generate returns, they generate costs. The labor illusion. If you've ever visited Dubai, you noticed the construction cranes, hundreds of them, a permanent fixture of the skyline like mechanical birds that never migrate. What you may not have noticed is who operates them. Dubai's economic model depends on one of the most lopsided labor structures on Earth. Roughly 85% of the population are foreign nationals. The vast majority are low-wage workers from South Asia and Southeast Asia, employed on temporary contracts with no path to citizenship, limited legal protections, and wages that would be illegal in most developed nations. This isn't incidental to the Dubai model. It is the Dubai model. The McKinsey Global Institute's reports on Middle Eastern economic transformation identified labor productivity as one of the Gulf's most persistent structural weaknesses. Despite massive capital investment, output per worker in the UAE's non-oil sectors lags far behind developed economies. The reason is structural. When labor is cheap and disposable, there is no incentive to invest in automation, training, or efficiency. You don't optimize when you can just import another worker. This creates a dependency that looks like strength, but functions as vulnerability. Dubai's economy requires a constant inflow of cheap foreign labor to sustain construction activity that generates GDP numbers. But that construction must continue regardless of actual demand, because if it stops, the GDP contracts, the labor force shrinks, the service economy that feeds and houses that labor force contracts, and the entire multiplier effect reverses. It's a treadmill. Dubai cannot step off it without the economy collapsing, and it cannot keep running forever because the fuel, Abu Dhabi's implicit guarantee plus global investor confidence, is finite. There's a historical parallel here that nobody in the Gulf wants to acknowledge. The antebellum American South built its entire economic model on cheap, coerced labor. Cotton was king. Plantations generated staggering wealth on paper. But the system produced almost no technological innovation, no industrial capacity, no self sustaining economic complexity. When the labor model was disrupted, the entire economic structure collapsed and took decades to rebuild. The mechanism is different. The principle is identical. An economy built on artificially cheap labor never develops the internal complexity needed to survive disruption. Dubai has built a version of this dependency at civilizational scale. The construction sector relies on workers earning a fraction of what equivalent labor costs elsewhere. The hospitality sector relies on imported staff willing to work conditions that domestic populations would reject. Even the financial services sector relies on expatriate professionals attracted by zero income tax, a benefit funded not by fiscal efficiency but by hydrocarbon subsidies and Abu Dhabi's implicit guarantee. Remove the subsidy structure and the tax advantage disappears. Remove the tax advantage and the talent migrates. Remove the talent and the financial hub narrative collapses. The historical graveyard. Dubai's promoters will tell you the city is unprecedented, that nothing like it has been attempted before. This is historically illiterate. Brasilia, built from scratch in the 1950s to be Brazil's new capital. Designed by Oscar Niemeyer, planned by Lucio Costa, funded by President Juscelino Kubitschek's ambition to drag Brazil into modernity. 50 years later, Brasilia is a functioning government town surrounded by satellite cities of poverty that nobody planned for. The grand boulevards designed for cars are hostile to pedestrians. The modernist housing blocks are sterile. The city works as an administrative center because the government mandates its use. It failed as a living city because you cannot legislate organic urban life into existence. Naypyidaw, Myanmar's capital since 2006, built in secret by the military junta, reportedly on the advice of astrologers, 20-lane highways with no traffic, government buildings spread across a zone larger than Manhattan, hotels with no guests, a city built for 1 million people occupied by a fraction of that, the ultimate expression of a state that confused construction with development. Astana, now Nur-Sultan, now Astana again, in Kazakhstan. Nur-Sultan Nazarbayev's vanity project, glass towers rising from the steppe, a Norman Foster designed tent that houses an indoor beach resort, billions spent to create a capital that would announce Kazakhstan's arrival on the world stage. The buildings are impressive. The economy beneath them remains dependent on oil and mineral extractions, exactly as it was before the first foundation was poured. The pattern is identical in every case. A political authority decides to build a showcase city. Spectacular architecture goes up. International media provides breathless coverage. Then the hard part begins, the part where actual economic activity needs to justify the investment. And it never does. Not fully, not sustainably, because cities aren't buildings. Cities are networks of human activity that emerge from freedom, necessity, and time. You can build the container. You cannot manufacture the contents. And this is where Dubai's story takes its darkest turn. Because the one advantage Dubai had over Brasilia, over Naypyidaw, over Astana, was access to almost unlimited debt. And debt, as any historian of empire will tell you, doesn't solve the problem of artificial cities. It amplifies it. It lets you build bigger, faster, and more spectacularly, which means when the correction arrives, the gap between the spectacle and the substance is wider. The fall is harder, and the wreckage is more complete. The debt clock nobody watches. Here's where it gets dark. Dubai's government-related entities carry debt estimated between $100 billion and $150 billion, depending on which obligations you include and how you classify the murky web of state-linked companies. For context, Dubai's own GDP is roughly $110 billion. That's a debt-to-GDP ratio that for a sovereign nation would trigger IMF intervention. But Dubai isn't a sovereign nation. It's an emirate within a federation. And that ambiguity is itself a weapon. When times are good, Dubai operates with the swagger of an independent city-state. When times are bad, it shelters under Abu Dhabi's umbrella. The debt is Dubai's. The guarantee is Abu Dhabi's. And the risk is everyone's who invested, assuming the guarantee is permanent. The Financial Times and Reuters archives from the 2009 crisis document something chilling. In the weeks before Abu Dhabi's bailout, there was genuine uncertainty about whether Abu Dhabi would intervene. The decision was not automatic, it was negotiated. And the price, though never fully disclosed, included significant concessions from Dubai's ruling family to Abu Dhabi's. The Burj Khalifa, originally named Burj Dubai, was renamed after Abu Dhabi's ruler. That wasn't a tribute, it was a receipt. What happens when Abu Dhabi decides the brand is no longer worth the cost? What happens when oil revenues decline sufficiently that Abu Dhabi's own sovereign wealth fund prioritizes domestic needs over subsidizing Dubai's debt? What happens when the next global financial crisis hits and the capital that flowed into Dubai's real estate market reverses course? These aren't hypothetical questions, they're actuarial ones. The timeline is uncertain, the outcome is not. Consider what happened to another debt-fueled spectacle economy, Iceland in 2008, a nation of 300,000 people whose banking sector had accumulated liabilities worth 10 times the national GDP. The bankers believed they had transcended the limitations of a small island economy through financial engineering. They hadn't. When Lehman Brothers fell, Iceland's three largest banks collapsed within a week. The currency lost half its value. The country required an IMF bailout. Iceland recovered painfully because it had something Dubai doesn't: democratic institutions capable of holding leaders accountable, an independent judiciary that could prosecute financial fraud, a population with civic bonds strong enough to absorb shared sacrifice. Dubai has none of these shock absorbers. Its governance model, effective during expansion, becomes a liability during contraction because there is no mechanism for distributing pain equitably. The workers get deported, the investors get restructured, and the ruling families make phone calls to Abu Dhabi. The Mirage holds until it doesn't. Every artificial city in history has followed the same arc: ambition, spectacle, debt, dependency, and then either slow hollowing or sudden collapse. Dubai has managed to extend the arc longer than most because it had advantages others lacked: a strategic geographic position between Europe and Asia, the backing of the world's most resource-rich neighbors, and a marketing operation so effective it convinced an entire generation of investors, tourists, and expatriates that a city in the desert with no water, no arable land, and no democratic accountability was the future of urban civilization. But geography is not destiny. When your geography is a flat, waterless desert requiring desalinated seawater for every drop consumed by a population of 3 million, strategic position matters only as long as the global trade patterns that make it strategic remain stable. And marketing eventually encounters a force it cannot overcome: arithmetic. The numbers don't work, they have never worked. Dubai's economic model requires perpetual growth in construction, perpetual inflows of foreign capital, perpetual willingness from Abu Dhabi to backstop the risk, and perpetual confidence from global markets that the whole arrangement is sustainable. Remove any one of those pillars and the structure becomes unstable. Remove two and it falls. So where does that leave us? You came into this expecting a story about a rich city in the desert. What you got instead is a pattern, one that has repeated in every century on every continent. Whenever political ambition substitutes for economic reality, the South Sea Company, Brasilia, Naypyidaw, and now Dubai, the skyline changes, the mechanism doesn't. The next challenge Dubai faces isn't a financial crisis, it's relevance. As Saudi Arabia pours hundreds of billions into its own mega projects, as Neom and Riyadh compete for the same foreign capital and expatriate talent, Dubai's position as the Gulf's default destination is no longer guaranteed. Competition is arriving, and competition is the one force that artificial cities built on monopoly and spectacle are least equipped to handle. The Mirage holds as long as you don't walk toward it. The moment you examine the water table, the debt structure, the labor model, and the dependency on a single guarantor with its own strategic interests, the image shimmers and dissolves. And that should make you think not just about Dubai, but about every promise of effortless prosperity, every skyline that rises faster than the economy beneath it, every system that confuses the appearance of wealth with wealth itself. Because the desert doesn't care about your architecture. It was there before the towers went up. It'll be there after they come down. The desert always wins in the end. The only question is how many get buried before it does. Subscribe to the Wealth Code.